Welcome to the Defense and Aerospace Report. I'm Vago Muradian here in Northern Virginia at the Naval Submarine League's annual symposium. It's a conference and trade show that brings together America's top submariners to talk about the future of the force's strategy, budgets, technology, and more. And we're honored to have with us Rear Admiral John Tammen, who is the Director of Undersea Warfare on the CNO's staff, N97, the latest of many, many names that have graced that office. Sir, thanks very much for the time.
Oh, you're welcome. Glad to be here.
It's a pleasure. You and I spoke in the Pacific Northwest when you were at Group 9, and now you've got this big job mapping the future of the force. Let's talk, you gave a great presentation on great power competition and all the things that the submarine force is doing to get ready for that, from better integration to technology to new attack submarines and new undersea platforms for the future. Talk to us a little bit about the threat profile without being too specific. The Kazan, the second of the Severodvinsk, or Yasen as the Russians call it, is out there, large cruise missile carrying submarine. That's already among the systems that are shaping your planning and thinking. Talk to us about this undersea warfare environment, the threat environment, as Admiral Chaz Richard, the ComSub 4 commander, said, we're going from capabilities-based to threat-based. As you look at that threat picture out there, how is that changing and how do you have to adapt in kind?
Yes, I'll say, if you look at the world writ large in terms of the undersea domain, everyone's kind of seeing the strategic advantage of stealth, of undersea platforms. So you're seeing across the globe, increased investments in quiet platforms that operate from beneath the sea, and I think the other part too is the stealth allows access, and I think from a threat-based perspective, there's various portions of the the globe that we need to be able to be the first there, and from a submarine point perspective, you need the stealth, the survivability, and the sensors to make sure you can get into those areas. And so when you look at our two principal competitors, they are making large investments in their submarine force to make sure that they are quiet and that they can operate around the globe. And I think it's upon us to make sure that we don't cede our current advantage to be able to counter those threats.
And you're looking at a much more integrated plan, right? I mean, there's the TSEP, the Tactical Submarine Evolution Plan, then there are the undersea plans. You're working on an integrated kind of approach to this that brings sensors together and unmanned systems, which are now in your office because N99 went away. Talk to us a little bit about what we should expect to see from this sort of more integrated, holistic plan to both grow longer arms, but also increase queuing and sensors. It's a full integrated package you're working on.
Yeah, so if you look at the undersea domain, there's tremendous opportunity to build an infrastructure, or architect an infrastructure where all the systems below the sea can talk, and not only talk amongst themselves, but transcend the air-water interface and make sure that we can communicate with the other platforms, so that at the end of the day, like Admiral Richard was saying, that we have this bigger, better, more connected naval force, and I think we're part of that, and I think there's tremendous opportunity in the undersea domain, particularly now that we're the research sponsor, not just for submarines, but for pretty much all the capabilities in the undersea, to make sure we provide that networked capability below the sea and through the air-water interface.
What do you think are some of the keys, right? I mean, that's obviously a big hurdle and a big challenge. We've surmounted some of it, both in the unclassified realm and in the classified realm. But how much, is the integration the key to maintaining this advantage? What do you see as the blend of new systems as well as better stitching things together in terms of being able to maintain that U.S. advantage?
Yeah, so I think the true advantage is to be able to stitch all those capabilities together, have them fully networked, have them be able to communicate, and because again, resources are limited, so you can't afford to have your capabilities stovepiped.
I'm going to get to resources in a minute, but about growing longer arms. Throughout the Cold War, submarines carried a variety of different payloads. It wasn't just torpedoes, but was sub-rock and Harpoon as well. Harpoon went back to the fleet at RIMPAC. USS Olympia was carrying it. It's good to see a Flight 1 688. I have a fondness for submarines with fairwater planes, I'm going to be honest. You served aboard Plunger, so you understand that. Talk to us about what that future weapons loadout needs to be for the future? You had a slide in there that's had unmanned underwater vehicles, air vehicles, but what does the fullness of that loadout look like, and at what point do you sort of run out of space on the boat to house all the things that you need for the future?
Yeah, so I think with the Virginia payload module, with the SSGNs, there's tremendous opportunity now to increase the payload diversity across the platform. And as I said in my brief earlier, is we're doing everything we can to make sure that anyone who would come to hunt us doesn't get a free ticket. On the flip side, we're also making sure that we're more lethal. And like you said, we're making sure that the weapons that we do develop have longer reach. And that kind of effort was started by Vice Admiral Connor when he was in '97, and then transitioned on to Sub 4. And we're continuing to pursue, a longer reach torpedo. We're working the next generation land attack weapon. And so all those efforts are designed to give the operational commander, the combatant commander, the best ability to execute his war plans.
We're looking at a budget. You've got a little bit of budgetary, so not only are you an operator, but you're a budget guru. 733 billion was going to be the plan. It looks like it might be closer to 700 billion. There were folks who say, well, 716 might be a good compromise number. As you see it, the submarine programs have been either plussed up or had stable funding, or we're on track to even further increase. What sort of impact, have you gotten any guidance about reducing programs? How will this budgetary reduction affect some of your priority programs?
So again, I don't know, since that's still very pre-decisional. What I would offer is that the undersea programs are, directly support the national defense strategy. So, but again, at the end of the day, it's about building the Navy the nation needs. So there's balances across the Navy's portfolio. So I think the short answer is we don't know yet. But again, I think the undersea systems will play well, just based on how tightly linked they are to the national defense strategy.
And that asymmetric advantage which Secretary Mattis has talked so much about. There is a trough in the attack submarine force. The requirement is for 66. There is 42, which would be on the current track. It seems like every year, last year was 5 688s were going to get refueled. This year it's 7 688s that are going to get refueled. How do you build through this trough? How many more 688s are you going to have to keep in service, right? There's cost associated to doing that for the ships. As how do you minimize the depth of this trough given the strategic environment we're in right now?
So tremendous opportunity with the seven refuelings that are capable. Again, there's a cost for each one of those, and right now we're funding the Cheyenne, which will be the first, and we'll make a business case analysis to do all 7. And again, like you said, if we don't do all 7 refuelings, we will drop down to a low of 42 SSNs, in the 2020s. And the requirement being 66, that's a pretty tough pill to swallow. So we'll continue that. There's also been efforts to look at times in the 30-year shipbuilding plan where we're not necessarily building a Columbia. There's opportunity there for the industrial base, and we'll see how all that plays out.
But you also have a backlog of ships that are already waiting on maintenance, right? Which is one of the reasons the Navy is going outside its shipyard structure to bring commercial yards in to do that work. I remember talking to Admiral Connor about that when he was ComSub 4, about what are the opportunities there, so that this is a plan that's been working for a while. Is there the industrial base capability to be able to have Columbia stay on track, to get to 2 774, 2 Virginias a year, to be able to do Virginia payload module, to eat through your backlog, and then to add 7 SSNs to that number for refueling?
So I think there is, and I think doing some of those private shipyard availabilities will ensure that we have a leveled workload for the workforce, for our principal shipbuilders. I will say that won't come without significant oversight and forethought, planning, and oversight, quite frankly. And and we can't take it for granted. We can't accept status quo. So we will have to manage that carefully as we move forward. And obviously the number 1 priority is always going to be Columbia.
The North Dakota is the first of the Virginia class that has a whole series of upgrade and improvements from sonar, strike, and other capabilities. But my understanding is the Navy plans only to buy 2 blocks of the Virginia payload module equipped ships. Is that going to be enough to replace the SSGN capability that you now have? I mean, the plan was like, well, we don't need 154 missiles, on one of the big converted ballistic missile subs, and we can do that with a fewer number of tubes, more distributed across the force. How do you eat through that gap, that shortfall potentially?
So I just did a slight correction. It's Block 5, Block 6, and Block 7 are all Virginia payload module ships. And as we move forward, as we recapitalize that Tomahawk strike capability, we will look closely at that. And then, as we get to a point where there's no margin left in Virginia to kind of upgrade its combat capability, that's when we're going to shift over to new SSN. And then also, if you look at the Columbia line, we plan on keeping that as a hot line and potentially producing a payload volume ship as well using that hull factor.
So you would be all 3 blocks are going to be pressed ahead with, because my understanding was that there would only be 2 blocks, so it's going to be all 3 blocks.
So right now the plan is for all 3 blocks to include the Virginia payload module.
As you're building the Virginia class out, you're also looking at the next generation of attack submarine in terms of what are its form, fit, function. If you look at that date, it's moving kind of quickly. It's 2029 in terms of defining it. I know you're working that. What are the rough characteristics do you want? Do you want bigger volume, bigger speed?
I'll just go back to the block. So Block 7 is still trade space.
Right.
So with Block 5 and 6, we will have met our minimum requirement we need for Virginia payload module. But to go back to a non-VPM boat may not be the right decision, but that's still trade space. So I just want to kind of give you that as well.
Understood. Okay, that clarifies a bit. But looking at the next submarine, right? You talked about putting the fast back in fast attack submarines. Our submarines are very fast still. But as you look at that future, more volume. What are some of the base characteristics? I know you don't want to be too specific about it, but if you were going to paint in big brush strokes, what would that new attack submarine look like that goes beyond Virginia?
So I'll say it's going to be fast and it's going to be stealthy. The size of the payload is still in the trade space, and I think that's where we're going to start baking in a lot of the advanced technologies we're developing today to make sure that submarine, which will likely be around for quite some time, will be combat relevant all the way through the end of its life.
2 questions. Let me ask you about unmanned underwater vehicles. Obviously the ConOps being working, the technology is being worked. You have a multiplicity of vehicles in your portfolio, from the very small to the very big. In fact, that was an eye-watering chart of sort of the purview of management. As you look, but it's a 2-part question. One is, do you need to do a better necking down of sort of saying, hey, look, you know what, we got all these devices and we've been in this sort of developmental area. Let's neck them down to a few more standard vehicles that are more easily supported in wartime. That's kind of the first question, and I've got a follow-up.
Yeah, so I think we've already done a necking down. The issue with the unmanned undersea vehicles right now is that one size does not fit all. So having 4 classes of vehicle, small, medium, large, and extra large, really makes sense right now as we continue that ConOps piece of development. But I don't think we'll get less than those 4 classes, because there really are a range of missions.
And they're tailored.
Yeah, exactly.
Let me ask you about propulsion. Russians are going for nuclear power for their large unmanned underwater vehicles. There's been a debate about power, fuel cells, diesel, electric, lithium ion, other sorts of power sources. Do you think the Navy would consider a nuclear unmanned ultra-large diameter underwater vehicle?
So I honestly don't know. That's not necessarily my.
I just thought two separate people have brought me up. Let me ask you about strategic systems. Columbia class, obviously, still top priority for the force. There was a welding issue that delayed. John Rucker, the program manager, did talk about, hey, look, we had 23 months of margin built into this program. We just ate through about 10 months of it or so. That he said 13 months. I can't remember how many months he said, but there's a number of months. That's right. He still has a little bit of margin, but not as much margin. Do you guys have enough visibility as to what the problems were? I mean, part of the challenge was nobody had built a ballistic missile submarine in the United States in decades, and that was a little bit of a challenge. Do you have enough visibility on what some of these challenges and problems are to make sure that you can do schedule mitigation to hit that 2031 date?
Absolutely. I think we have a very good relationship with the shipbuilder and the sub-vendors who work for the shipbuilder. And we have done due diligence here and really dug deep into the root causes of what happened. And I think, as we move forward, we will not only fix that, but we'll make sure that we cast the net wide to make sure that other areas of the industry don't have similar problems.
And well, the last question is, there's been a lot of talk about killing donkeys humanely, which are problems and impediments to progress. You've talked about running faster with scissors and managing to mitigate that risk, but also be able to do the job. What do you think the keys are to speed, right? The submarine force has always prided itself on being able to satisfy requirements very, very quickly and adapt very quickly. Now, as you're going into this great power mode, much more when you were a Cold War submariner earlier in your career, what are the keys to doing this successfully?
So I think the real key is kind of like the one slide I showed up there, is the experimentation piece, is letting all stakeholders know what the warfighting requirements are, and if they can spend IRAD or their time to develop a technology, then bring it. We'll do successive iterations of that technology to make sure we give the warfighters what they need. But to just sit there and do PowerPoints and PowerPoints and PowerPoints, I don't think is going to get us to go faster.
And the giant shadow antics and stuff like that.
So I think giant shadow, silent hammer, follow-ons to that, antics, I think are very important as we try to go faster.
And silent hammer was yours?
Yes, sir.
Sir, Rear Admiral John Tammen, Director of Undersea Warfare. Sir, thanks very much. It's always a pleasure.
Thank you.